Elsie Jensen here. Tonight we are going to be making a Mexican beef stew and we're going to be baking up our sourdough breads. So I've got my 2 Dutch ovens preheated to 500 degrees. They've been in the oven for the last hour. And I just took these out of the fridge from their cold proofing. We have our just basic sourdough bread, and then we have an everything bagel sourdough. So let's start with our loaf here. I'm going to flip, whoa, almost dropped it. I'm going to flip it out. Kind of give it a nice smush. And let's score our sourdough. I'm going to do a nice kind of long, deep score along the side. And then we can do our little, like, pretty little wheat kind of score. There we go. And let's do just a couple little lines. And a couple little lines over here. And now we're going to put this one in our oval Dutch oven. Remember, these are really, really hot. So use your oven mitts. So we've got, this is our traditional, our basic loaf. Put the lid on so we can trap in that kind of heat and moisture. And now we are going to do our everything bagel one. And this is where we put everything bagel seasoning in it, and then we kind of crusted the outside of it with the everything bagel as well. So here we're going to do a nice kind of crisscross score on it. So we're just going to cut right there and all the way through. Just make it nice and deep. And then we can do kind of our little wheat grass scores here. I'm sure they have a special name, but they just always look like the little wheat leaves to me. There we go. And now we're going to put it in our round Dutch oven. And again, these are very, very hot. Beautiful. And there we go. And now we're going to pop these in our oven that we have preheated to 500 degrees. There we go. Again, make sure you use good oven mitts because these little suckers are hot. So I have my oven preheated to 500 degrees. Got the first one in and the second one. And I cook them at 500 degrees for 20 minutes with the lid on. Then I'm going to take the lid off and cook it for 20 minutes at 450. So we'll turn our heat down. So I'm going to set my timer for 20 minutes so I don't forget to take the lid off. And otherwise, if you don't take the lid off, you won't get a nice golden crust on it. So got to remember. Let's start on our Mexican beef stew. So we are going to put a little bit of olive oil in our Dutch oven here. I believe this is a 5.5 quart pot, so a big one today. I'm putting my heat up to about a 6, and we're going to chop up 1 big yellow onion. This is a pretty big one, so I otherwise use 2 smaller yellow onions because you want that onion flavor to really come out in this stew. And we're just going to kind of cut. I'm going to peel off this whole outer skin because none of that is really good. It's chewy, doesn't cook up nice. And then we're just going to do kind of a small dice on it. So I'm going to make about 4 to 5 slices across. And then we're just going to square it off. There we go. And then I always get, when I get to that end, I like to flip it because it's a little bit slippery on the far edges. And if you just flip it to the side, you have a little bit more stability when you're slicing. And we're going to do the same thing over here. Make about 4 to 5 slices across. And we're going to square it off to make our nice little dice. And then once we get to that very end, I always flip it over just because it's easier to cut that way versus trying to cut into your hand. And then we're going to put these in our Dutch oven. We're going to let them saute up. And again, that was one really big yellow onion, but that's probably equal to two smaller ones. And you want to use yellow onions because yellow onions caramelize better, have a much better taste in stews versus red onions are better for eating raw, and white onions are better in salsas. They have a bit more of a kick to it. So yellow onions are the best. Okay, I'm just making sure all my onions are coated in the olive oil. And now I'm just going to slide this cutting board in the back, and we're going to cut up our chuck roast. So here's about, I want to say this is probably about 2.5 pounds of chuck roast. We're going to cube it up into nice small bite-sized pieces for our soup. You could also use stew meat if you wanted. Stew meat has various cuts of beef in it, so you'll have chuck roast in it, but you'll also have round roast. Just any leftover scraps that the butcher has is what goes into stew meat. So I personally like chuck roast a little bit better. I think it just cooks, it's just a delicious meat. It's got a nice marbling of fat in it, so it's very tender. And so we're going to be using that here tonight. And again, if you see any really big chunks of fat, you'll want to cut those away because, again, those won't cook up very well. But this one doesn't seem to have too much on it. It's more of a well-rounded. A lot of times with a chuck roast, you can get a nice, like, fatty vein going right through the middle of it. There. So we're just going to cut some strips here, and then you're going to want them to cut them up into nice bite-sized pieces like this. Round size of like a dice, maybe a little bigger, because they'll shrink a little bit when you cook them, but when you're eating your stew, you got to think you don't want anything that's going to be too hard to eat through. So if you cut your meat too big, then you won't be able to eat it gracefully. Okay. We're going to just cube off these. And hopefully we've got another storm cell coming in through here in Tennessee. So hopefully the power stays on and everything goes well all day. I've been getting these like emergency notifications for Nashville, like flood imminent, seek shelter, severe things they've been calling nonstop. And so hopefully we keep staying safe here and keep our power. There we go. So I'm going to give them a nice toss over here because I do want them to caramelize. And so you just want to constantly stir them so that they don't stick or burn to the bottom of your pan. And let's cube these. And I will say, if you do buy stew meat from the store, a lot of times you're going to have to just cut it up as well because they'll give you some pretty large chunks, and those are just going to be really too big to go in your stew straight up. So you're going to need to chop them a little bit smaller. Let's cut this little bit of fat off here. And this is like so it's kind of like a cadillo, which is a Mexican beef soup, but that uses salsa verde and some like peppers and more spices. This one, we're going to use a little bit of a tomato base, but we're going to use some chipotle, cumin, some chili spices in it. So it's a little bit different than a cadillo, but kind of similar along the same lines. But it's going to be a delicious, fragrant broth, a meaty broth for the stew.
We have 2 questions actually. Where did you get your bread bowls, and do you have cheesecloth lined in them when you proof the bread?
So yes, so I got my Banneton, which are the bread bowls from Amazon. I actually just bought them in a sourdough kit. It came with like jars and all the bells and whistles. I will say if you're starting sourdough, getting one of those kits is just really great. It makes it super easy. And it does have a cheesecloth liner. Now you don't have to use the cheesecloth liner. You can do it without it. And then you'll kind of get a little ridge design on it. I just I've always washed them up and I have them. I have a couple sets of the bowls. So I don't have just two. I have like 6 of them. So I've always got one prepped and ready to use. But you can definitely use it without the cheesecloth liner. Just sometimes it can stick if you haven't floured the bowl as well, versus the cheesecloth liner is really good about helping create that nice crust without also like sticking to the cloth. But I do I do flour the bottom of it, even the cheesecloth as well, so it's not just straight up without flour. I put some flour in the bottom of that as well. And I just use all-purpose flour. I don't waste money on the rice flour because rice flour doesn't burn as easily as all-purpose flour, but I find that it all-purpose does just fine for me. I haven't had any issues with it. Okay, a few more pieces here. Let's give these onions a nice thing. You can see they're starting to really caramelize up now. We're getting some nice golden brown colors. And you can see the steam is escaping off of them. They're natural liquids, which of course makes a delicious, fragrant smell. Here. But I will say, if you are going to do that sourdough journey, I did it a couple of times without the bowls or in the set, and it was like $50 on Amazon. I got a little sourdough set, and it actually just was so much easier. And so I will say it was money well spent. Now there's like a few things in those kits that I don't use, but pretty much everything I used that came with a scorer, which I've done scoring with a knife before, and that just does not work. You really do need a razor blade. And then it has the little spatulas and the jars and the dough whisk. It comes with a dough whisk. So I will say they do have a lot in them. Okay, we've got our meat cut up. I'm going to go put my cleaver in here. Let's give this one big stir. And then we're going to add in our chuck roast. But I wanted to make sure my onions have a nice caramelization. They're nice and golden brown first, because once you put the meat in, you're not going to get that caramelization anymore. So let's put all of this in here. And then I'm just going to stir it up so that it's all mixing around. And this is going to be the starting base for our Mexican beef stew. There we go. Just scooping it around. Make sure the onions get really mixed in with the meat here. And now I'm going to turn my Dutch oven down to about a 4. And then I'm going to give my hands a quick rinse. Okay. Let's get our cutting board here. And we're going to chop up some celery. Now, if you're using the full celery, keep the leaves on it. Leaves are great for stews. These were the pre-cut, pre-washed, like bulk pack. So I'm just going to cut off the ends of each side because it always dries out and they get really stringy in stews. So I always like to get rid of those ends. And then we're just going to I'm going to cut them down the middle in half to make them a little bit thinner so that we don't have huge chunks of celery. And then we'll throw these in there with the beef in just a second. And this is, you don't technically have to cut them down the middle, but I find that nicer, smaller chunks of celery, my kids will eat them better versus if it's a huge, big chunk. And it just kind of makes for a nicer stew, like the texture of it. Here we go. And now that I've got them all, we're just going to chop them right down like this. And this is going to add just a lovely flavor to the broth as well. Celery is just delicious. It really enhances broth. It gives it a nice complexity. Okay. I'm going to let the stew brown up just a little bit, this meat. But while that's there, we're going to put some spices in. So we are going to use about a tablespoon of oregano, which is all I have left in this jar. And we're going to use some cumin, some ground cumin. So I want about a tablespoon. So I'm going to use this and then a little bit of my other one. I'm always like so happy when I'm done with a jar of spices because for some reason I always have like 20 jars of spices in my cabinet.
You have a question? Generally, how much celery is good for a stew?
It depends on the size of your stew. So this is going to be feeding like 8 people. So I used about 8 mini stalks of celery, but I find that celery doesn't overpower it. So sometimes when I'm making a big thing of chicken noodle soup, I'll use the whole big stock that you can get from the grocery store. But I find for a small batch of soup for about 4 people, you want 5 to 6 stalks of it for it because it just really enhances the broth. So we put in a tablespoon of oregano, a tablespoon of cumin, and we're going to put in some paprika. I've got about a teaspoon and a half of this, so we're going to throw that all in there as well. And we're going to give it a couple shakes of garlic salt, but we'll also be using some beef bouillon in a little bit. Give it that's going to be about a teaspoon of garlic salt. And we're going to add in some garlic. Let me go grab a spoon. We're going to add in about 4 to 5 cloves of garlic. So it's about 2 teaspoons. There we go. And now we're going to give this a nice big stir. We're going to let it kind of heat up and cook up because I find that when you heat your spices up with a little bit of oil in there and the meat, it really helps bring out the flavors. There we go. And now I'm going to just turn mine up to about a 6 on my Dutch oven. And then we're going to add in our celery. And this can let them start stewing up. Here. So let's add our celery in. Let's give it a good stir. Perfect. I just want to make sure I get all of that celery coated in those spices as well and throughout the meat so it can really kind of flavor the meat a bit before we add our broth in. Okay. So let's prep up our peppers. We're just using 2 bell peppers. Now, if you like spice, throw in some either poblano, habanero, jalapeno peppers, whatever you like. We are spice babies in this house, so we are just going to do good old bell peppers. So I'm going to just cut them off, and then I'm going to pop out this stem part on each one. And we're just going to get any of these little seed pieces out. And a lot of people will just cut off the tops and then they don't use this. But if you just use your fingers, you can pop that little stem out and then you've got another whole bit of pepper to use. Let's grab any of this because it's just not good. And then we're just going to do a simple dice on these. I always like to cut my peppers from the inside versus the outside because they cut much easier through the inner flesh versus the slippery skin. There we go. So just a really simple dice on these. And through here. And again, I'm using red and yellow. I like to stick with the red, yellows, and orange peppers or even the little baby sweet peppers. I find green peppers are a bit bitter. And so I like to use these. I think they're sweeter, more mild, and just have an overall a nicer flavor complexity.
You have a question? Why do you leave your spoon in the stew?
Because it's always, I never just take it out, but I make sure I use silicone, which is like food grade cooking utensils so they can withstand up to 550 degrees heat. I will say make the switch to silicone, because if you're using non-cook or non-stick cookware, you can't use metal in them. And so you have to kind of either use plastic or wood. And I find silicone is the best. It doesn't scrape anything and it's heat resistant. You can actually bake in silicone. So it just works well. And then I don't have to have a plate out or a spoon rest. It won't fall. You know how many times I have knocked spoons over or went over there. So I'm kind of, I'm going to say I'm a klutz, but I'm kind of like chaotic. I'm like an organized chaos. So I like to kind of jump around and move a lot. And that kind of sends things flying sometimes. It's kind of how I am in life too. I know where everything is. Well, no one else will know where it is because I've got a system in my mind. There we go. So we've got our peppers. Nice simple dice on them. Let's give this a big stir first, and then we're going to throw those in. So for any of those who have jumped in late, we've got onions, celery, chopped up, cubed up chuck roast, and then we put some cumin, some oregano in, some garlic, and some paprika. And we're cooking that up to start with, and we'll add a bit more spices in just a second. But this is going to be for our Mexican chicken stew. And now if I did bell peppers, but if you like a little heat, feel free to throw in jalapenos, poblanos, habaneros. Any one of those are good. Will give you a nice kick. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Let's get our potatoes cut up. So I've got a bunch of just little baby potatoes, and we're going to quarter these so that they're not super huge in our stew. And you can also use, you could peel up a gold potato or a yellow potato. I would avoid russet. Russets they don't work as well in stews and soup. They're a bit more starchy and they'll kind of turn to mush. So you want one of the potatoes that have a bit more of a waxy texture, like these little baby potatoes, new potatoes, a gold potato, Yukon potato. They've got like a million names, but not russets. Here. These will keep their shape even if you cook them for like ever, but they'll be tender, which is nice.
You have a question? Do you guys farm or garden at all?
I do have a small garden. I will say we're kind of like in suburbia where we live, and so we have like a 1/3 acre, and I do grow some, but we have a lot of lovely trees in our backyard, and I don't want to cut them down. So I have limited growing area, but we typically grow a huge herb garden. So I have lots of fresh herbs, and then tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. A couple of years, right outside our backyard, we have this like community lot, and I've grown some pumpkins. The problem is we tend to go on a long vacation during the summer. It's about 2 to 3 weeks. We do this epic camping trip and then spend a week at my sister's lake house. And they all die because Tennessee summers are hot. Okay, before we add those potatoes in, I hear our bread calling us. It is ready for us to take off the lids. And that way we can see a sneak peek at how they're turning out. Okay, gotta get my oven mitts on. Let's pull this guy out first. We're gonna remove the lid. This is our traditional loaf, our basic. You see our beautiful crust. It's got a nice, lovely pop on it. And then let's get this guy. I hear ya. And, oh, beautiful. This is our everything bagel loaf. It has a beautiful pop on it as well. And then what we're going to do is we were baking them for 20 minutes at 500. Now we're going to bake them for 20 minutes at 450. I like to turn it down so that my crust doesn't get super dark. I like a nice golden brown. And then I'm going to set my timer for 20 minutes. And you can always take it out a few minutes before, a few minutes after. It's not a big deal. You just want to make sure you get it around that. I like to keep mine more of the light golden brown because I like to eat it for a couple days afterwards, make some grilled cheeses with it, toast it up. And I find if you get it to a really golden, dark brown crust, it's not as good toasted up. Okay, here are our potatoes. And we're gonna throw them into our stew here. Oh, we still need this. I don't know why I'm putting that away. Let's give it a stir. Then we're gonna chop up our tomatoes. We'll throw them in, and then we're gonna get our broth to start simmering on it. Beautiful. Smells so good. Okay. So we have right here, we've got 4 tomatoes. You could also use a can of tomatoes if you wanted. There we go. I'm just gonna peel out, take this little center piece out real quick and get that where, this is where the vine was. And that just never cooks up. It will be chewy, so I always make sure you cut those out of your tomatoes. Here we go. And then we're just going to kind of cut them up in not super small because the tomatoes are going to just kind of fall apart in the soup. They'll shrink up, so they're not going to keep their shape, but they add just a little, the acidity is great, and they add to the broth. Here we go. Oh, you know what? Before I cut up the rest of these, let's put in some tomato paste. We're going to let that kind of enhance up before we add the broth in. So we're going to use I have about 2 tablespoons left. So we're going to throw this in here. A little quick hack. Most of the time you get tomato paste in a can, but I like to get it in the jar so that I can just toss it in the fridge. And then I don't feel bad about like using, it doesn't go bad. Otherwise you have to put like plastic wrap. Okay, I'm going to give this a good stir. And this tomato paste is really going to enhance the broth of our stew. It's going to give it a really rich flavor to it that will just really work with the Mexican, like the spices that we're using without making it super heavy. There we go. And we're just going to let it kind of heat up and meld into those spices that we have. Let's chop these guys up. There. And again, these don't need to be like perfect in any by means because they are really going to just kind of disintegrate into the soup, but they will be lovely. And again, also you can use canned. I always have canned tomatoes in my pantry. It's always one of those staples I keep because you can just throw them into so many different things. But whenever I do have fresh, I'll use those first. I like to get like that. You can get like a 3-pound box or 4-pound box from Costco of the vine ripe. And those are just so nice to have because you can make so many things with them. Okay, let's toss these guys in. And rescue this one. Give it a nice stir. And then we're going to add in some broth. And it has a lovely, you can really smell the oregano and the cumin in here. It gives you that, cumin has that really distinct kind of earthy Mexican like smell. It's delicious. Okay, I'm going to start with some water and we're going to use some beef bouillon and a little bit of chipotle pepper bouillon. Now you could use straight up beef broth if you wanted, but I prefer bouillon because I can get a little bit more flavor out of it for less liquid. So we're going to pour this in first. Get my burner over.
Yeah, question. What's the name of the stew?
This is a Mexican beef stew. So it's not quite a cadillo, which is the Mexican or the Spanish name for it, but because that uses like salsa verde and some spicy peppers in it, but it's similar. It's like my take on it, but it will have that nice hearty Mexican flavors in it, the peppers and the tomatoes, but we're going to have lovely chunks of beef. You could also sub out the beef and do chicken and just use chicken broth instead, and it would be delicious.
Maybe you get time to explain that you don't really follow recipes. You
Oh,
test
yes,
everything.
I do. I don't really follow a recipe at all. And so when I like to experiment with cooking, and I think that comes with having cooked for so long. You know, it's like when people say cooking's like an art, it truly is, because you have to know the flavor profiles and what works together, what vegetables works together, how to cook them, when to cook them. And I love it. Versus baking is very much like follow directions and then you have your product. We're going to do a big heaping spoonful of beef bouillon. This is going to give you the saltiness to your stew, so you don't need to add any extra salt, as well as just really enhance that broth. That is it's going to be like a beefy tomato broth with, of course, some Mexican undertones. And then we are also going to be using some smoky chipotle bouillon. I love this. You buy it right next to where you buy the beef one in the broth section of the store. But this is great for Mexican cooking. I use it in my and I'm going to just I don't use quite as much, about a teaspoon. It packs a lot of flavor and it does have a little punch of heat. But I use it in like my chicken tacos, my Mexican, my chicken tortilla soups. I have 2 types of chicken tortilla soups that I make, but I love it. It's delicious. Let's stir that up. I want to make sure all of our bouillon gets in there. And then we're going to let this come to a beautiful simmer. And we're going to prep our cilantro for this. And then we're going to make a creme fraiche. It's going to be a cilantro lime creme fraiche that you can drizzle over it when you serve it up. And we're going to cut up our pineapple. And then hopefully dinner will be ready. So we've got that stirred up. Let's get our cilantro here. So it's kind of a little sad pack of cilantro. I bought it a couple days ago, but you know, if you want your herbs to stay super fresh, you're supposed to like put them in water, but who has time for that? I'll be happy when I can get my garden up and then I can have my fresh herbs. So here we just want the leaves of our herbs. We don't want the stems, because the stems, while they do have a little bit of flavor to it, they don't have a great texture. So try to get as much of those stems out as possible. Unfortunately, there's really no great way to de-stem your herbs other than by hand. I've tried all the tricks. They had like these little things that you could thread them through, but it's just as much work. There we go. And you want to use fresh cilantro. In case you guys didn't know, when cilantro is dried, it goes by another name. It goes by coriander. And a lot of places will call fresh cilantro coriander too. But they taste very different. And I know a lot of people have strong feelings about cilantro. They say it tastes like dish soap. Like half my family says that. And I find that if you actually grow your own cilantro and you pick it fresh right away and you don't let it sit, it has less of that flavor, because the enzyme that causes that flavor hasn't had a chance to break down. So if you can, a really fresh cilantro doesn't have that flavor as much. And it makes it is, I feel like, a great spice, but I get it where people are like, ugh, not cilantro. Here we go. We're going to use a little bit of this in our soup, and we're going to use the rest to make this kind of creme fraiche with some cream and some lime juice and then some cilantro. Unfortunately, we're almost done here. I just want to try to get as many of these stems out as possible so that you're not chewing them. There we go. Okay, let's get rid of this pile here, and then we're just going to do a quick mince on them. So when I do my mince, I like to just make this big pile, and then I put my hand here, and then we're just going to rock it back and forth. Then I'll put it all back in a pile, and we're just going to go over it several times, and then I'll switch the directions, and this will help get a really fine mince on it. And now we're going to go this way, because I will say this is not a good chopping method. You have no power behind it. So you have to do like 10 times as much work to get the same chop. There we go. Perfect. So we're gonna save some for our soup in a little bit and some for our creme fraiche. Let's go make our creme fraiche. Let me grab a bowl real quick. We're gonna put a little bit of this cilantro in here. That is about 2 teaspoons of fresh cilantro. Let me grab my knife. Okay. So if you've never made like a creme fraiche before, we're going to put some cream, heavy whipping cream. Got to use heavy whipping cream. We're going to fill up our thing. That's about a half a cup. Then we're going to take our fresh limes and we're going to squeeze it over the top, the juice. We're going to let it sit, and the acid in the limes is going to cause the cream to curdle. And so it's going to essentially make like a sour cream or creme fraiche. But it will be delicious that we'll be able to spoon this over the top of our soup to give a really bright kind of creaminess to it with a lovely lime and cilantro tang. So there. And here we go. Just going to use 1.5, and then I'll save that last little bit for a little squeezing over the top of our soup, just to give a nice little acidity towards the end. So you don't want to stir it yet. You want to let it sit, because if you stir it, it doesn't like get the curdliness that you want. Now let's cut up our pineapple. We're going to have pineapple for our fruit today. Because you know what? I feel like Mexican food and pineapple they belong together. You know, that citrus fruits. I feel like citrus fruit is like Mexican. Like, that's what I think of when I eat like that Mexican cuisine or even Spanish cuisine. When I was in Miami last weekend, Fort Lauderdale, we were in Miami for like one day. But I went to this really delicious Spanish restaurant. It was called Tapas. And it had the best paella and the best tapas, which are like little plates that are typically served at like bars in Spain. And growing up, my grandparents, they had a house in Spain. So I would go and visit them during the summer. And, you know, they liked to eat out at least once a day while we were there. And, you know, this restaurant just reminded me of all the food that I had growing up, the paella. And it had this dish, it was called a paella negra, which is like black paella, but it's made with squid ink, which if you've never had squid ink, don't knock it. It's delicious. It's like a sweet, savory, almost has an umami flavor to it. But it was a dish that my grandfather used to make me when I was there, which was the rice with the squid ink. So it's jet black. And then he would saute up fresh calamari over the top. And it was so good. And I felt like I was, you know, transported back in time to the delicious, you know, meals that he used to make. He was one of those things where I learned a lot from him. He was a culinary genius. He was just a genius in general. He was a nuclear physicist who was just like one of those Renaissance men. When I remember that he had this lemon tree in Spain, and he grafted a lime branch to it so that his tree would grow both lemons and limes, which ingenious, apparently using a technique that the ancient Mayans used to use.
You have a question? How do you know which pineapple to pick?
So when I get them, most of the time when you get your pineapple from the store, they're not ripe yet. They're bright green. And so when I go to pick it out, I look for the ones, so it was green, but it's starting to get gold. And the more gold that it gets, especially you see these little creases, once those are getting gold, they're ripe. So here I have another pineapple, and it is nowhere near. This needs another 2 or day base. See how this is dark green? You want it to get lighter green to gold. That's when you know your pineapple is ready. Don't wait for it to go too long, because if you wait too long, it will start to get like little brown spots like that. So I always just cut those off. But that is how you know. So typically, almost every pineapple I get, it has to sit on my countertop for 2 to 3 days before I cut it up, because they always pick them when they're like bright green. For 2 to 3 days before I cut it up, because they always pick them when they're like bright green. My kids' school is canceled again tomorrow. An hour late. Okay, not bad. We're in Tennessee right now, and there's some pretty big storms going through here, and they were canceled yesterday, because there was a tornado in EF0 that passed through in one of the towns in our county. And in the South, you cancel by county, not by school not by town. So they got a free day today, and it looks like tomorrow they at least have a delayed start. And who knows? I think we're supposed to get a couple more storms tonight. Just hope it doesn't flood. When right after college, when we moved back to Nashville area, they had the floods of 2010 here. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard about them, but they were awful. We had this huge mall here called, it's reopened now, called Opry Mills, but it was completely underwater, where they were like taking boats through it to make sure people weren't going in there, to keep people safe. And it was just insane how much damage that flood. I remember, I feel like 2nd Avenue was flooded. I think Vanderbilt Hospital was flooded on the 1st floor. So it was crazy. And I feel like I was talking to my husband. I'm like, gosh, this weather feels so much like that weekend back then. And I remember it because my oldest daughter, was just a couple months old at the time. And we went to my parents' house because we were afraid we were going to get trapped in because of the floods. And I think, oh, that was ages ago. But this weather, it feels like it. So I'm just hoping everyone stays safe and nobody's property gets flooded.
It's funny, that's what you remember, and now you work in 16-hour days, 7 days a week for 8 weeks.
Yeah, I remember that. My husband then got the brute end of cleaning up and going through and making they did that restoration effect to rip out everything in people's houses to prevent the mold from growing. He was doing that for nonstop. There was no breaks. I don't remember that because I didn't do that. I enjoyed my time at home, and I enjoyed his overtime money. Okay, let's give this a nice stir. Now let's go look at our creme fraiche. Let me get a spoon. Now we're going to be ready to stir up. So here, you can see it's got a nice kind of it's got like these curds in it. There you go. That is almost like a sour cream, but this is going to have such a lovely flavor to it. It's so thick, and that's just the acidity of the lime curdling the cream. So it's going to give it a really tangy, fresh flavor, which is just perfect. And then what I like to do, because surprise, surprise, we're going to add a little bit of garlic salt. This is my favorite seasoning here. Just a little bit gives you that nice salty garlic taste to it. So it's like a cilantro, lime, garlic creme fraiche. And if you want to be really bougie, you could say fraiche, but it's fresh. But I like to call it fraiche. Okay, we've got this. Perfect. And I have a feeling our sourdough is about to ping. So let me get our soup. I'm going to taste it, see if we need to add anything to it, because I think we're about to wrap up here. This is the time to season.
You have a question. Could you use lemon instead of lime?
You could definitely use lemon. A lot of times when I don't have buttermilk or I don't have sour cream, I'll use lemon because it's a lot less tangy. I find for the Mexican, lime really pairs well, but lemon also works. It's a little bit sweeter, but either one, the acidity of the lemon will curdle it up just fine as well. It will just have a slightly different taste, but in the same kind of ballpark. Okay, tastes amazing, doesn't need anything else into it. It has this lovely kind of mild Mexican flavor to it. We're going to throw in a little bit of cilantro, and we're going to save a little bit to garnish the top with. There we go. Okay, let's go check on our, it's beeping now. We're gonna go check on our sourdough because they should be done. Okay. Beautiful. I always love it when it turns out so perfect. Okay, here is our gorgeous traditional loaf. Look at that beautiful crumb on it. You got it. And now we're gonna go get our second loaf, which is our everything bagel loaf. Again, beautiful, gorgeous, delicious. You're always so happy when they pop. I had one time where my fridge outside was set too cold. I put it right underneath where the freezer was, and my bread froze and it did not pop. I always take it out as soon as it's in because you want your crust to stay nice and soft. And if you leave it in your Dutch oven, see how it's perfect? If you leave it in there too long, it will continue to cook. And here is our everything bagel one. And that's the one we did. Our everything bagel sourdough is our basic recipe, but we put our everything bagel seasoning in it, and then we did a crust on the outside with it. And then, of course, our beautiful traditional sourdough loaf, which is just perfect every time. And even look at this lovely burst on it. Beautiful, just beautiful. Okay, guys, let's serve our dinner up. Okay, I'm going to turn off my, and let's do a bigger bowl today. I'm not going to cut into my sourdough because when you bake sourdough, it needs a bowl today. I'm not going to cut into my sourdough because when you bake sourdough, it needs to rest for about 10 minutes before you cut open because otherwise all that steam escapes out of it. But let's get our soup here. So this is our Mexican beef stew. So I'm going to put it in our bowl. It has a just lovely broth. We had potatoes, tomatoes, celery, onions. And then we're going to put a little bit of Mexican cheese, or you could use cheddar cheese, or you could use cojito, which is that traditional fresh Mexican cheese. So we're going to do a nice little sprinkle of cheese. And then we're going to do a good dollop of our cilantro lime. And then we're going to squeeze some fresh lime juice over the top and then garnish with a little bit of cilantro for our Mexican beef stew. It has just a lovely kind of cumin, oregano, tomato broth, and then the nice beef chunks just add a little extra flavor. Plus, we'll serve it with our fresh pineapple and our sourdough bread.
You have a question. I guess it froze for half a second. Why do you not cut into the bread right away?
Because when you take it out, there's steam inside the bread. And if you cut open it, the steam escapes. And when you take it out, it's still cooking a little bit. And so if it escapes right away, then you have more of a gummy inside. So always let it sit for about 10 minutes and then cut into it, and it'll be perfect every time. Well, guys, we are done cooking up dinner tonight. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, show you what we're cooking for our family. And feel free to comment or message us if you have any cooking questions or recipes you'd like to see. Again, thanks so much for joining us here today.